Hello everyone, Philip Travis here, History Changes on YouTube. In this video I want to talk briefly about the emergence of a really important socio-political movement in the post-World War II period. And this is, of course, as you see from the image, the rise of the New Left, which really rises to its zenith, its peak, in the late 1960s, early 1970s. Pictured here we have Herbert Marcuse, the German philosopher of the Frankfurt School, who is typically credited with being one of the most central figures in the organization of the New Left. Over here we have Abbie Hoffman from the United States. Abbie Hoffman is usually associated with the hippie movement in the 1960s, a counterculture figure, and also broadly associated with the New Left. So, the New Left in the 1960s is really significant, in part because it's the New Left that sort of breaks away from sort of the traditional sort of leftists in the world, and this in many places in Europe and the United States results also in the emergence, or it doesn't result in, I suppose that's the wrong way to say it, but is also associated with, on the other side, the beginning unification of modern conservative movements. So I want to think a little bit about this, or I want you to think a little bit about this, and if you're on my YouTube channel, I hope you enjoy this video, and if you're in one of my classes, summarize this, or if there's any other activity that I have related to it, just focus on those and using the video for the information in the video for those purposes. So, first of all, when we think about what we might call traditional social liberalism in the 20th century, we're talking about things like in Europe, for example, the emergence of social democracy and the emergence of what was termed the welfare state in Great Britain. If you're talking about the United States, you're talking about things like the New Deal, sort of New Deal liberalism, which brought Social Security, the Tennessee Valley Authority, these types of things, unemployment, as well as through the 1960s, of course, reaching its peak, New Deal liberalism does in the United States, with Lyndon Johnson's Great Society, which brought programs like Medicare and Medicaid, which are all still enjoyed by Americans today, as well as in Western Europe, the social democratic states of Western Europe, which emerge after World War II. These remain highly intact sort of government social systems. The old sort of traditional liberalism, leftism if you will, in the Western world was primarily focused on economic factors, right? It was focused on class inequality, meaning that they were primarily concerned with whether it was the Great Society of Lyndon Johnson, whether it was Harry Truman and the GI Bill of Rights, or Franklin Roosevelt in the New Deal, or in Europe it was Great Britain and the Labor Party and the development of a welfare state. It was primarily focused on economic inequalities and addressing these by providing things like health care, cost-effective transportation, and these types of things. The New Left is a break from this, and in the sense that the New Left is really shifting focus. So, and we'll talk about why it shifts focus. But in the short, the New Left it's not to say they're not unconcerned with problems of economic inequality, but they're looking at inequality more broadly, particularly from the standpoint of racial inequality, gender inequality, sexual inequality, these types of things. In part, they're trying to respond to what they see as a real shortcoming of the old sort of liberal way of doing things, which they view as having really been inadequate in addressing fundamental inequalities related to gender, sexual, racial, systemic inequalities. The New Left was a transnational movement, and that's why we're talking about America, we're talking about Europe, because it's a transnational movement. And historically speaking, transnationalism, this refers to movements that are not limited, right, by a particular state or border, but instead involve broad, encompassing ideas, shared reactions to changes and events in the world. And so, to that respect, what were sort of the critical sort of catalyst for the New Left. In short, I think the catalyst for the New Left, it was events in the world. Things like, for example, many in the 40s and 50s on the left sort of idealistically looked at some of the things in the Soviet Union. The communist experiment was, for many, not necessarily something you might want to directly emulate, but it was something that there was inspiration there. However, in the 1950s, particularly when Khrushchev, the premier of the Soviet Union, really begins the campaign of de-Stalinization, it really brought a lot of transparency to a lot of the really significant injustices of the Soviet Union and the Stalinist experiment. Obviously, events like the Katyn massacre, these things were brought to the fore. And this really brought a lot of criticism and critique towards the Soviet Union. In the United States, you have events like the Vietnam War, which was a huge catalyst for the New Left in the Western world broadly. The Cuban Revolution. The Vietnam War and the Cuban Revolution really served to bring a critique from the left that was really critiquing imperialism and its fundamental violation of human rights and of self-determination. The New Left is mobilized too by things like environmental crises in the world. It's motivated by things like nuclear weapons and the threat of nuclear annihilation. Many New Left thinkers would ultimately become important activists in the anti-nuclear weapons campaign. It was also, of course, catalyzed by the civil rights movement and fundamental sort of inequalities, gender inequalities, and also sexual inequalities. And so the New Left really breaks in the 1960s, and we see this really reaching a zenith in 1968. There are protests across Europe in 1968, as there are also in the United States. In the United States, of course, much of it directed at the Vietnam War, and much of it directed at the presidency of Lyndon Johnson, which really speaks to the extent to which the New Left was breaking with the old sort of liberal order, because Lyndon Johnson, when it comes to the old sort of liberal order in its attempt to address issues of poverty and economic inequality, Lyndon Johnson is second really only to Franklin Roosevelt when it comes to using the government to promote important social reforms. We already mentioned some of those, Medicare and Medicaid, for example. Across the Western world, in the late 60s, these issues, persistent inequalities for women, persistent inequalities on the basis of race, of sexuality, growing concerns about environmentalism, about war and imperialism, about nuclear weapons, and the association with the leadership at the time in the world being associated with the old leftist structure, this really leads to new critiques and a new movement called the New Left. And the New Left really begins to break with the old status quo sort of liberal order over some of these issues. Interestingly, in this context, you will see in many areas over time, you don't really see this really come to fruition, I would say, until around about 1980 or so, but you see a unification of a conservative movement. Certainly this is the case in the United States, right, with the emergence of the election of Richard Nixon and then ultimately the popularity and election of Ronald Reagan. But you see the unification of a conservative movement at the very moment where the New Left and your traditional economically focused leftists began to fracture, right? And so in the United States, you had, with the New Deal, you had a social democratic order, really. I mean, it's the closest thing the United States came to that. It's not really a social democracy in the way that like a reform socialism that we think about in Europe, but it was major unprecedented steps in that way that occurred first with Franklin Roosevelt's New Deal and then culminating, of course, with the Great Society of Lyndon Johnson in the 1960s. In Europe, you have the emergence, right, of the welfare state, of true, robust social democracies in Great Britain, in France, in West Germany, right? By the late 1960s, you see, as I said, the New Left really break apart from the liberal order for the issues that we mentioned, right? Fundamental persistent inequalities, environmental issues, imperialism and war, leads to much more robust critiques of the status quo. And when we get to the 1980s, you start to see a story that is no longer about the triumph of liberalism, which it seemed it would be in the 1960s, right? In the early 1960s, it looked as though you were witnessing a real triumph of sort of traditional liberalism. And by the time you get to the 1980s, you're talking about a triumph of what might be termed the modern conservatism, also a transnational development as well, and more robust in the United States, I think in many respects, than Europe. But this creates very significant ramifications for the world today as well, because many of those government interventionist economic programs associated with traditional liberalism will fall under increasing sort of political attacks in the greater Western world. So, 1968, this critical year, protests across the Western world, largely driven by the ideas of the New Left, which really sought to address core inadequacies of traditional leftism, particularly when it came to issues of human rights, of imperialism, of environmental problems, of fundamental inequities for people based on race, gender, and sexuality, in addition to issues that were primarily economic and class focused. Right? You know, really quick, like Herbert Marcuse came from the Frankfurt School. And the Frankfurt School emerged in Germany during the Weimar Republic. And they were a real like socialist movement, and they really promoted some of the ideas of Marx. When you get to the New Left in the 1960s, some of the older ideas of Marx, or the more traditional ideas of Marx, like those ideas associated with revelations and realizations about what the Soviet Union was all about, it created a lot of cynicism on the part of the New Left. And in the case of socialist thought, many New Left thinkers actually looked to the young Karl Marx's ideas. And these were works that Karl Marx had written when he was very young. They were never published. They, as a result, had not really been associated with the works of Karl Marx. And they began to rediscover the young Karl Marx and other sort of ways of looking at robust sort of social critiques and pursuits to a broader form of equality in the world. So the New Left. If you're just watching this on YouTube, I hope you enjoy this video from my History Changes channel. If you're one of my students, be on the lookout for an activity associated with this. Probably just summarizing this video, though sometimes maybe I'll create a quiz for it. So thanks for watching, and I hope this is informative. Thanks, everyone.